Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me here for this lesson. In this video, we're going to be talking about organizational culture. We're going to be talking about what culture is, why culture is important, and how we develop and maintain the culture within our organization. Now, let's take a look at this definition of organizational culture here. It says culture refers to a system of shared meaning held by members that distinguishes the organization from other organizations. Now, there are two key parts to this definition I want you to take a look at. Okay. The first one is shared. All right. Shared is critical here because if all the members of your organization, or at least a majority of the members, don't actually share what they believe your culture is, then that's not really part of your culture. That's part of some people's experiences. Okay. So for example, if you believe you have an autonomous culture within your company, that employees have autonomy, okay, but very few employees actually believe that, then that's not a shared system of meaning. Okay. The other component here is distinguishes. All right. So your culture needs to be something that makes your organization different from other organizations. So, for example, you can't really say that paying your employees is part of your culture because everyone pays their employees. So, paying your employees doesn't really distinguish you from other companies. However, paying your employees above market wage or ensuring that all employees make a living wage, that could be something that distinguishes you from other organizations, and it could be a component to your culture. Here we have a list of 6 factors that are considered to be very important components of organizational culture. All right, the first one here is adaptability. What adaptability deals with basically is how much do you allow people to be creative or innovative or flexible in the work that they do? All right, so do you allow your employees to experiment? Are employees free to try new things? Or do employees have to do things a specific way? So if you let employees do things in a creative way, then you probably have a pretty adaptable culture. But if you require that employees follow specific processes and procedures, then you probably have less adaptability in your culture. All right. Next, we have detail orientation. So, how important is it to be precise within our culture? Now, in some areas, this matters more than others. All right. So, in a hospital, if we're dealing with surgeons, we probably want to have a very detail oriented culture because it's probably pretty critical that surgeons follow and pay attention to the right details. Okay. In other areas, it may not be quite as critical. All right. Then we also have results and outcome orientation. And what this refers to is how much do we focus on processes versus outcomes? Okay. So do we care how people do the work, or do we care about what results from the work? All right. And then we also have people and customer orientation. So how much does management really think about the impact of their decisions and the company's work on all sorts of different people, including our customers and our employees? All right, and then we have a collaboration or team orientation, and that deals with basically how well people within the company work in groups, how well they work in teams, and how integral that is to the work that they do. And then finally, we have integrity, which really focuses on, how are ethics and integrity incorporated into our organization's culture. And at the bottom here, I have a little question for you that asks, does organizational structure support culture? And if so, how? Well, if you think about this, if you go back to our structure unit, think about span of control. Okay, we looked at wide spans of control, we looked at narrow spans of control, and in a narrow span of control, a manager might only have 4 employees underneath them. Well, think about with a narrow span of control how that's going to influence the adaptability component of culture. All right, if we have a narrow span of control, adaptability is probably fairly low because if I'm only managing 3 or 4 people, I'm probably going to be a little more involved in the work that they do than I am if I have a wide span of control and I have 25 employees underneath me. Okay, so how we structure our organizations is also going to play a very critical role in how our culture develops. Now, here we have another common framework for organizational culture. And what you'll notice as we look at this framework is that this cultural framework has a lot of overlap with the list of characteristics that we just looked at on the previous slide. So, first we have the clan, and this one really deals with human affiliation or our relationships with other people. All right. And that's a lot like the people customer orientation characteristic that we just talked about. Then we have the adhocracy, and this really deals with having a culture based upon change. Okay. So employees value things like growth and autonomy and stimulation. And this is very similar to the adaptability component that we talked about previously. Then we have the market. And in the market, our cultures are a little more focused on achievement. All right. So we may be a little more competitive. We may be a little more focused on outcomes. And this is kind of related to the results outcome orientation characteristic that we talked about just one slide ago. And then finally we have the hierarchy. All right. And the hierarchy is focused on structure and stability. All right. And this one, again, this might have a little bit of overlap with adaptability as well, although not quite as much overlap as we saw when we looked at the autocracy. So let's take a deeper dive into the clan here. Okay. And as we talked about before, in the clan, employees value attachment, collaboration, trust, and support. They really identify with the organization. They identify with the people within the organization and what they're working towards. So I'm going to tell you one of my favorite stories here. And if you watch a lot of my videos, you probably heard this story already because I tend to tell it quite a bit. But in 1962, President John F. Kennedy visited the NASA space station. Okay, now at this point in time, Kennedy had put out this edict that NASA was going to put a man on the moon, that the United States was going to be the first country to put a person on the moon, and this was a vision that he had put out there, that President Kennedy had put out there, without really knowing if we could do it. Okay, and there were a lot of people who were behind it, and it was a very exciting time. And really, it was the one thing that NASA was working towards at that time. I mean, obviously, they probably had a few other things that they were working on, but this was the main focal point. So one night during a visit to NASA space station, President Kennedy is walking through, and late at night he sees a janitor mopping the floors, and he asks the man, Why are you working so late mopping up these floors?" And the janitor replies to him, "Well, I'm not mopping floors. I'm putting a man on the moon." And what's symbolic of that response is that this person, they looked at their job and they understood where their job fit within the organization, but they identified with what the organization, with what their coworkers, with what everyone around them was doing. They identified with what all these people were doing. They saw themselves as a critical component to it. Because the bottom line is, when you have highly educated scientists working in your facility, if you're not keeping that place clean, if you're not keeping that place professional in such a way that people want to work there, then that's going to impact what that work environment's like. And this janitor, he recognized that, and he had this connection that he felt with the people around him and the work that they were doing. And that is evidence that there could have been some elements of the Klan in the organizational culture of NASA at the time. We're also going to take a little look at the hierarchy here. Okay. And in the hierarchy, employees value communication. They like things to be formalized, they like routines. Okay. And a great example of the hierarchy comes from the Man Gulch disaster of 1949. Okay. And what the Man Gulch disaster deals with is there was an incredible fire out in the wild in Montana, and firefighters had to go in to attempt to put this fire out. They were unable to put it out by air, so people had to actually parachute into the area to try to put the fire out. And these firefighters were highly trained. They were specialized. They had specific policies and procedures that they followed. Um, it was very out of the ordinary for them to deviate from the systems that they were used to. But when they got out into this area, when they got out to fighting this fire was like nothing they had ever seen before, and they couldn't fight it the same way that they could using their typical procedures. And there were things that happened where they tried to surround the fire. There were things that happened where at one point they were directed to put down their tools and run. They were basically just told, put down everything and run for your lives. And some of these different directives that they were given out there deviated quite a bit from what they were used to. And these deviations from routine are actually identified as reasons why this disaster was as bad as it was. Because what experts who have analyzed this disaster believe is that the firefighters' inability to deviate from the routines that they were so used to is part of the reason why so many lives were tragically lost in this disaster. Okay, and this is a great example of a culture where we are um, embracing values similar to the hierarchy, and often there are many great things that can come from this stability, particularly in positions like a firefighter where you do need stability and you do need to have assurance in the face of dangers. But this the Man Gulch disaster also provides us with an example where culture could actually be a detriment. Another factor that's important to consider as we think about organizational culture is that organizational culture is a descriptive term. It is not evaluative in nature. Okay, so we're not evaluating whether or not the culture is positive or negative when we think about organizational culture. Instead, we're just trying to identify what it is. So does the organizational culture encourage teamwork? Does it reward innovation? Does it stifle initiative? Okay. Now, for some people, rewarding innovation may be something very positive, but other people may prefer to see something else rewarded, and that's why organizational culture is descriptive in nature and not evaluative. All right, and this differs from job satisfaction, where we're actually evaluating how the organization satisfies our needs. Unlike job satisfaction with organizational culture, we're simply just identifying what the organizational culture is and describing it. Within our organizations, we often have dominant cultures and subcultures as well. And the dominant cultures reflect the core values of the organization. And these are typically things that you'll see throughout the organization. So when I teach this unit in a classroom, I'll ask students to think about three things that if they were to describe their college to someone who didn't know the college at all, about what made the college unique. Tell me three things that make it unique. I'll ask them to list them. And often what I'll find is that 80% of the students might have one thing on their list that I find from all the students, right? So there's one thing that maybe 80% of the students will throw out there. And I'll say this is part of the dominant culture, okay? Because this is something that all of you have identified here because this is throughout the entire college. All right. But then there will be these things that some students say and other students don't say. And as I tend to tease it apart, what I'll find is that while it seems like all these students have very different things on their list, students who work in different departments who have different majors, they may have similar areas, right? So a student whose major is communications might have other things that they say that are similar to what other communications majors say. And accounting majors might say things that are similar to other accounting majors. And management majors might say things that are similar to other management majors. And what basically is coming out of this is that there are different subcultures within the college, and these subcultures are emerging. They're presenting themselves as students are describing factors that they consider to be emblematic of the school itself. Now, a strong culture is one where the core values are intensely held by people throughout the organization. Okay, and when we have a strong culture in our organizations, what we find is that we don't have to manage a lot of behaviors very specifically because people will manage them themselves. They're part of their core values, they're part of the culture, and they will drive the way people behave. All right. So for example, I've worked in companies where part of our culture was that everybody came in early and you would show up to work, and if you were there a half an hour early, everybody else was there. And you never had to tell anybody to come in early because it was just part of the culture. Everybody did it. And there would be a little bit of behavior managing in the sense that if somebody came in 15 minutes early, people would joke about them being late. But for the most part, everyone always came in very early because that was part of the culture and it was very strong. I've worked in other places where you don't have everybody coming in very early. Some people come in early, some people come on time, some people come on late because you don't have a strong culture as far as that particular aspect of the workday is concerned. So, in a strong culture, what you find is that people hold these very similar values and they live by them. An example of a company with a strong culture that you may be familiar with is Zappos. And I tend to use Zappos as an example quite a bit because Zappos is a very unique company. All right. But one of the things they do at Zappos is they actually have employees take what they call an oath of employment. All right. And they use this to highlight values and get employees to commit to these values within the company. And what Zappos says is that essentially they are trying to serve a higher purpose. All right, because they recognize that if they're trying to serve a higher purpose, they're going to grow, they're going to perform well, and that's truly what they believe. All right, and what you'll see is that Zappos has some very unique core values, such as deliver wow with service. All right, build a positive team and family spirit, be passionate and determined. All right, while also being humble. All right, there's the list of their core values is over here on the right hand side, but Zappos employees live very strongly by these values, and there's a lot of unity amongst employees in dealing with this. And I've spoken with many employees at the company who have actually confirmed this, and the company's culture book also confirms this as well. So Zappos is a company that's a great example to take a look at and read about a little bit if you want to understand a company with a strong culture. Now, culture serves a variety of different important purposes within our organizations. All right, so first things first, what culture does is it helps to define boundaries for the organization. So it helps to show what makes our organization different from other organizations out there. And by doing that, by building those boundaries, it also helps to convey a sense of identity for members. So we as members of the organization, we understand what we're a part of because of our culture. We understand how that culture that makes us different from other organizations, how that contributes to what we're doing. And because it does that, it also helps to facilitate commitment. All right. So it helps to make us committed to the organizations because we see a bigger purpose other than our own self interest. All right. Building off that, it also helps to enhance our social system because it helps us to facilitate relationships within the organization. All right. Because if we're going to support the culture, if we have a strong culture within our organization, we're going to support that. We have to interact with others and support each other. And it also, through doing that, helps to serve as a little bit of a control mechanism within the organization. So on the earlier slide, I talked about how we had a culture of coming in early, and if somebody came in early but not too early, we joke about them being late. Well, that was part of our culture, and it was part of the control mechanism that was present within our culture. Within our organizational cultures, we also have organizational climates, and these are shared perceptions about the organization and the work environment. They tend to be a little bit more narrow than the culture itself, whereas the culture is kind of an all encompassing descriptive term. The climates are perceptions that are a little more narrow. So maybe we have a climate for safety, maybe we have a climate for service, and so on and so forth. All right. And the organizational climate can influence people's behavior. Climates can interact with each other, and they can influence factors such as job satisfaction and other employee attitudes. So for example, organizations that have a strong safety climate tend to have higher levels of job satisfaction. Our organizational cultures also influence ethical behavior within the organization. So, do we have an ethical culture or do we not have an ethical culture? All right. Often, what we'll see is our culture will determine things such as do we lie in negotiations or are we truthful in negotiations? All right. How do we treat people, both interpersonally and from a procedural standpoint? All these factors that are related to our ethics within our organization are truthfully embedded within our culture. So, the culture that we develop is going to determine whether or not we are building an ethical organization. Now, ethical climate theory tells us that there are five prevalent climate categories within an organization that pertain to ethics. Right? The first category is instrumental, and an instrumental climate category basically is one where managers treat employees and other members of the organization as if they are constantly looking out for their own best interests. So we look at people as if they're looking out for themselves and not the organization. Now, not surprisingly, the instrumental climate is related to lower levels of job satisfaction. All right. So when we have an instrumental climate, we tend to find that people are less satisfied in their work than they are in other climates. All right. The caring climate deals with looking out for other people. All right. The independence climate deals with freedom and autonomy within your work. Now, the law and code and the rules climates are very similar, but the differences between them is that the law and code climate deals with regulations that come from an external force, and rules are related to something that is more internal. Okay. Now, what you'll also notice is that these four categories here, caring, independence, law and code, and rules, they are all associated with lower levels of turnover than the instrumental climate is. When our organizational culture supports sustainability, what we're doing is we're developing practices that help to improve the longevity of our resources, the longevity of our processes, and so on and so forth. So, when we were younger and we were all in social studies classes, we learned about things like crop rotation, right? Where farmers found that they had to grow different crops on different fields every year so that they didn't destroy the land. That's an example of a sustainability practice, right? And we see this in a lot of our organizations today. All right. One of the things that we'll see battery charging stations for cars where organizations will have special spots encouraging people to drive electric vehicles. Okay. And that could be part of your culture. We see companies like Best Buy that have major recycling programs and other programs that are designed to be environmentally friendly. And all of these types of programs that we talk about that are related to sustainability, they do two things really. One is they do help to protect the environment and ensure that there are longevity to our practices. Okay, but they also position companies uniquely to one, speak to their values and declare what they're doing to help the world, but two, also to potentially be more profitable in the future. Organizational culture can also contribute to innovation. All right, so out in the Silicon Valley and tech heavy areas, we often see playful cultures, cultures that are a little unconventional when we compare them to what we might see in an area like the Northeast. All right, and the reason for this is that companies that are trying to do creative things, companies that are trying to innovate, they're trying to unlock different aspects of employees' thought processes. Okay, so when I went out and I did a tour of the Silicon Valley, I found that there were gyms and volleyball courts and foosball tables and all sorts of different things at different companies because they encourage their employees to do things other than just working while they were at work. All right. At one point in time, I was in an incubator and I went into the incubator and what I found was people were playing volleyball in an office without a net, without a court. They were just playing volleyball. It was what they were doing to try to just open up their minds and be a little more innovative. All right. But it's not just in tech and creative industries where we need to have innovative cultures in order for our employees to innovate. So, I could go back to my time in the building materials industry, and I was in a company that I would say had a somewhat innovative culture itself. All right. And we were innovative because managers were encouraged to do new things and to do different things to help grow their businesses. And we were structured in such a way that you weren't punished if something didn't work. Okay. So you might be praised if it did, and you might be questioned about why something didn't work, but you were free to do what you wanted to do. And I remember at one point in time, I had done something, I had taken kind of a big risk and changed a whole aspect of my business. And my district manager was in and we were walking, taking a look at it, and he said, "Oh wow," he said, "this was a pretty gutsy move." He said, "How's it working out?" And I said, It's not working out that great right now, but we'll see how it goes." And he said, "Well," he said, "you made two other gutsy moves and they worked out really well. If this one doesn't work out, you win some, you lose some, and we'll move on." Well, having that freedom to make those decisions, that was part of our culture, and it did help bring some innovation to what we did. Our cultures can also be an asset to our businesses. Okay, if you look at the picture that I've got up here, this is a picture of some employees from the Pike's Place Fish Market in Seattle. All right, and this is actually a very well-known fish market because of their organizational culture. All right, they're known for having a very playful and fun culture. They're yelling all the time, they're singing, they're getting customers involved, they're throwing fish at them, they're playing catch with fish. They do all sorts of crazy stuff at this market other than just sell fish. All right. They make sure every day is a game. Okay. And people go sometimes to buy fish and people go sometimes just to watch them and see them have fun. And their culture has become so well known that a video about their organizational culture is now one of the most common training videos shown in companies. Okay. But what has happened is because of their innovative culture, their fun culture, what they've done is they've built a market. They've become essentially a tourist destination in addition to a fish market. So their culture has proven to be something that has helped to drive their business. Now, for all the great things that we've talked about with organizational culture, our organizational culture can also act as a liability. And one of the ways that it can act as a liability is through what we call institutionalization. And this is what takes place when we start to place value on our organization for the organization itself rather than for what the organization does for people. Okay. And what I mean by that, I'm going to give you an example here, and I'm going to talk more about this company later on in this video. But back in the mid 2000s, I went and moved companies, and the company that I went to was one that prided itself on service. And that was what they really sold me on when they were recruiting me, was that they were a very service-oriented company, and that I was going to be very happy working for this organization. And when I got there, what I found was that they didn't provide the level of service that they claimed that they provided. And I questioned it a few times, and people often told me how lucky and how fortunate their customers were to be dealing with them, but they didn't actually talk about what it was that they were doing for their customers that was good. They said we're providing great service, but if you ask for examples of it, they really couldn't come up with examples because they had just come to believe that they were something better than what they were actually doing. Okay. And this is kind of related to barriers to change. All right. There were several times that as a manager, I tried to propose that we change some of the organization's processes, and there was a lot of resistance to this. And when I finally did change some processes, as a pricing manager, I changed some processes, and people saw what I was doing. They said, "Well, why are you doing this?" And I said, "The way that we're doing things, is not really meeting the needs of our customers. We're not doing what we need to do here." And they said, "Well, this is the way we've always done it. There's no need to change." And the culture made it very difficult for me to move the needle on some things. And we were able to make the changes I wanted to make, but I had to do so in the face of some resistance. All right. Culture can also serve as a barrier to diversity. And the reason for this is as we're trying to build our culture and maintain our organizational culture, we often try to hire people who are going to fit into that organizational culture. And when we do that, we have the tendency to sometimes make more homogenous hires than we would if we weren't focused on culture in our hiring process. So when we're hiring, we do want to make sure that we are cognizant of the fact that we want to be open and inviting to people of all cultures and all backgrounds. All right. There also within our organizational cultures can be some toxicity and dysfunction. So we talk a lot about how culture can build upon good things within the organization. Well, culture, it can also build upon the bad. All right. So when things start to go downhill, as our culture builds around some of this negativity, the organization's climate can become worse and worse. All right, and then finally, culture can be a little bit of a barrier to acquisitions and mergers. One of the things that is the most common problem when organizations merge or when acquisitions take place is that the cultures of two different companies may be very different, and it may be hard to integrate employees from the two different companies. Now, we've talked a lot about what culture is and what it does, but now we need to talk about where it comes from. Our organizational culture starts with our founders, okay? Because the founders have the vision of what the organization should be. But it's important to recognize this because many founders are so focused on what it is that they want their organization to do in the big picture and how they're going to be profitable that they don't think about what the culture should look like. All right. And a great example that I love in discussing this deals with Tony Hsieh, the former CEO of Zappos. Before Tony was the CEO of Zappos, he founded Link Exchange. Okay, and Link Exchange was a company that was used for online advertising, and it was something that he founded right after college. And this company grew and was very profitable, and it ultimately ended up being acquired by Microsoft. But as Tony was building this company, he didn't really realize what he was doing in terms of organizational culture. And near the end, around the time that Microsoft acquired Link Exchange, Tony himself admittedly says it in his own book, didn't like working at Link Exchange. And through the transition, he had an incentive package to stay on and help with the transition. It was a very, very large incentive package. And he actually didn't finish out through the incentive package. In his book, he talks about waking up one morning and really just not wanting to go to work and deciding that he wasn't going to finish out his contract and actually just left money on the table because he found the culture at the company he founded to be something that did not work for him and he did not want to be there. So then after Tony left Link Exchange, he founded Venture Frogs, which was a venture capital firm that invested in small startups. And one of the startups that they invested in was Zappos. Tony eventually became the CEO of Zappos. And as CEO of Zappos, he put a lot of focus on organizational culture because he said he never wanted to repeat what happened at Link Exchange. All right. And what you find with organizations, the reason founders are so important is because the organizations when they're first founded are small. And that's where you have the real ability to impact culture and help to drive it. Once an organization becomes larger and larger and larger, it's a much more difficult task to shape and change the culture. So there are a few ways that founders can really influence the culture that they're creating in their organization. And one is to hire employees who think and feel the way they do. And what I mean by this is not necessarily hiring people who are exactly like the founders, but hire people who share those core values and those core beliefs that the founders have that are essential to the culture. And the truth is we have to be very careful here because we want to make sure that we are open-minded and that we don't discriminate in hiring as we're trying to find people who will fit with the culture. Again, we have to think about what are the core values related to this culture and can the people that we're going to hire work within those core values and embrace them. Okay. Now they may have some differences from other people in the organization, and that's great, but we do want to make sure that they're going to be able to support the core values that we're trying to build around. Okay. We also need to socialize our employees into thinking the same way around the core values that we do. Okay, so we have to make sure that we do things, whether it's talking about the values, having training related to the values, doing different things to help make sure that our employees are all thinking about our core values in very, very similar ways. All right. It's great to have diversity of thought within our organizations, but when we're thinking about our values, we do need to have some alignment within our values. Okay. And we also need to make sure that the founder's behavior is encouraging employees to follow these values. Okay. So are the founders talking about values or are they living the values? All right. And hopefully it's going to be both. But if they're talking about values and not living them, then it's going to be a little bit challenging to build the organizational culture that we're striving for. Now, as we think about socializing our employees to a culture, we go through three different stages in this process. All right, and the first stage that we're going to go through is what we call the pre-arrival stage. And this is the part where we kind of give people some insight into what they think the culture is going to be. All right, so during the hiring process, we tell people about the company, we tell them about everything that's going to be great, and so on and so forth. That's all part of the pre-arrival stage in the socialization process. Then we get into the encounter. Okay. And the encounter is a little bit different because the encounter now you're part of the organization. All right. So when you get into the encounter, you kind of get to figure out, what were they maybe not fully candid with you on during pre-arrival, and you start to have kind of these moments where things are a little bit different from what you expected. So for me in the company that I was referring to earlier when I was talking about institutionalization, I had heard all about how this was a service oriented company. Then I get there and products that my competitors are turning around and delivering same day, usually within a couple hours of ordering, we're telling people you got a 3-day wait on that. Okay. And to me, during this encounter stage, I'm like, oh my gosh, like we said we were service oriented. This is not service oriented. And that was a little bit problematic. So, I had to kind of work through that to a certain degree. All right. And then finally, we have the metamorphosis stage. And this is where the employees start to adapt to the culture and they start to embrace the culture for what it is. All right. Now, what can happen here is instead of going through a metamorphosis where we adapt, we can end up over here at this outcome of turnover. All right. And that's a little bit problematic, obviously. But however, if our employees do adapt and they adapt well, then they'll be more productive and they should have stronger commitment. Now, I want to encourage you to take some thought and think really here about this turnover this turnover aspect, because if we do have turnover occurring as a result of what's happening in this encounter stage and employees' inability to kind of go through a metamorphosis, this is a little bit problematic, right? Because you're hiring people because you see value in them, and now you're losing them because they don't embrace your culture, because they thought your organizational culture was something different than it is. So you have to think about, how are you presenting your organizational culture, because you don't want to spend your time, put your resources into hiring good people only to lose them. Okay? That is not good for you, it's not good for them, it's not good for anybody. All right? And the other challenge with that is that you might have had the opportunity to hire somebody good who would have fit within your culture if you had been a little more candid about what your culture involved. All right. So it's very important that during this pre-arrival stage, that we are open and honest and give a realistic job preview, and really speak to what our organizational culture is, because we don't want to hire good candidates who are the wrong candidates. We want to hire people who are going to fit within our organization and help support our goals. Going back to that encounter stage that we just talked about before, this is a great poll here that tells you about what people are most shocked by within their organizational culture. And you'll see the top three things that people are shocked by when they start with a company are employee morale, the number of hours that people work, and the supervisor's personality. Okay, so once again, we want to make sure that we are fairly candid with people, but some of this stuff is hard to be candid on. Okay, we can be candid on how many hours people are going to work. Okay, we can be straightforward about that. All right. But it's really hard to say, hey, the morale here in the company is not that great, or your supervisor is going to be a real jerk. It's hard to say that kind of thing during the pre arrival stage. So if you do have a negative employee morale, or you do have supervisors whose personalities are not supporting employees, you need to address those issues, because if people come into your organization, they're shocked by these things, they're going to leave. You're going to lose good talent. And that is certainly not what we want to see happen as managers. Now, recapping what we've discussed so far, your organizational culture starts with the philosophy of the organization's founders. And their philosophies are going to drive the selection criteria for new employees. This selection criteria is going to influence who your top management are. It's also going to influence how you socialize your employees. And these two factors here are going to go ahead and influence your organizational culture and the outcomes derived from it. Now, there are several ways that we transmit our organizational culture to our employees. And the first one that we're going to discuss here is through the use of stories. And the story that I've got up here on the screen, it's one of my favorite stories that's used to transmit organizational culture. And it tells a story about a, years ago, a customer walking into a Nordstrom's in Alaska. And where the Nordstrom's is, it used to be some type of tire warehouse or automotive store. And the customer walks in with a tire or multiple tires and goes to the counter and says, I bought these here. I'd like to get my money back. And now Nordstrom obviously does not sell tires, but the sales clerk who had been working there saw the price on the side of the tires, took money out of the register and refunded the customer, even though they don't sell them there, just to keep the customer happy. And this story gets used to basically try to tell the story of how important customer service is and communicate to employees, where the company's culture is in terms of customer service. Okay. And part of the reason that this is one of my favorite stories is because I don't actually know what company this happened in. The first time I heard this story, I was actually an employee at Home Depot, and the story was told as if it happened at Home Depot. Okay. And when I Googled the story to try to find it, that was when I really learned that there were a lot of other companies that use this same story. Nordstrom being one of them, but there are many companies that have this story or a very similar version of this story that is told within the company. All right. And the purpose is again to communicate where customer service stands in the culture of the company. And this is a great example of how this is done. Rituals are also very important to transmitting culture. Okay, and rituals are things that happen periodically throughout an organization. So, for example, back when I was with 84 Lumber, we had a ritual that was called Spring Visit, And it basically took place at the very end of our slow season as we're going into our busy season every year. And what happened was district managers traveled with regional vice presidents, and they also traveled with one or two people from the executive team from the corporate offices. All right. And in preparation for this, every store spent a month or 2 months prepping their store, trying to make it look really good for spring visit. Okay. And that preparation involved cleaning every last crevice of the store, repainting all the shelves, and then often trying to build one project that would be kind of your wow factor for when they came into your store. Okay. And they always looked for what your wow factor was going to be. And this was just one of our rituals. It was something that we did every year. It was something that helped us make sure that we maintained a standard because every year we had some type of refresh in our stores. All right. And we also try to do something innovative once a year in order to prep for this. And the other component to this ritual was that every employee got an opportunity to meet with somebody from the executive team who was traveling with Spring Visit. And I remember my very first time that I was there for Spring Visit, I was only an hourly employee, and I actually got to meet with the president of the company. And I had a great conversation with her, and truthfully, the conversation that I had with her during that spring visit was really what jump started my career. So this ritual was very important, and it helped instill in me the importance of opportunity in our culture. All right. We also have symbols and material symbols that influence our organizational culture. So if I was to go back to 84 lumber, I would say one of our material symbols was that everybody wore the same uniform. Everybody had a navy blue shirt that had the company's logo on it. All right. And the symbolism of this was one, to show that all employees were members of the same team, and two, to try to reduce the power distance between employees and show that rank was not something that was symbolically mattered in the company's culture. Okay. So whether you were an hourly employee, whether you were a general manager of a location, a district manager, or regional vice president, you all wore the same uniform, and that was very symbolic of our culture. All right, language is also very important, a very important tool in communicating our cultures. Okay, so sticking with the theme of my time at 84 Lumber, an important component to the language they used was the term co-manager. Now, co-manager was really an assistant manager in a store, but they called them a co-manager for a couple of reasons. One, they wanted that person to understand that they had important decision making authority within the organization. They wanted others within the organization to understand that that person had important decision making authority. And they wanted the general manager of the location to respect the decisions that the assistant managers had to make. So rather than calling them assistant managers, they gave them this name of co-manager. And that component of the language really communicated something about our culture. All right. There was also a time that I was with a consulting company called NISTEC, and the CEO at the time, Mike Walsh, used to always speak about the NISTEC experience. So when he talked about behaviors that he wanted people to enact in the workplace, he would talk about them and say, well, if we think about the NISTEC experience and what it is that we want to deliver to our clients, we have to do this and we have to do that. And that language was very important to communicating his expectations and particularly how they pertain to the company's culture. Our organizational cultures are also going to influence ethical behavior within the organization. So we need to think about how managers can create a more ethical organizational culture. One is to be a visible role model. Okay, if as a manager you are out there doing the right things in front of your employees, they are going to follow your lead. All right. Second, we want to communicate our ethical expectations. There should be no ambiguity as to how we expect our people to behave. Okay, so if we don't think that lying in negotiations is something that should happen, we need to clearly communicate to our people that they need to be honest in negotiations. All right. We also want to have ethics training. Okay. That's aligned with communicating our expectations, but it's going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into ethics and their importance in the workplace. All right. Critically, we want to visibly reward ethical acts and punish unethical acts. All right. When I was a manager, for example, one of the things that I had no tolerance for was any theft in the workplace. All right. And, you may have heard on one of my other videos, I one time actually fired an employee because they stole a bag of peanuts. All right. It didn't matter what the dollar amount was. Theft was something that we had zero tolerance for in any organization that I ran. All right. And this was important because To me, if we didn't have repercussions for theft, then I would be sending the message to my employees that that type of behavior was okay. But we also want to make sure that in addition to punishing unethical acts, that we make sure to reward ethical acts. So if you see somebody do something good, you have to make sure that they get some type of praise for that. All right. We don't want to just manage in a management by exception type of situation. We want to make sure that when we see good things, we are rewarding them. And then finally, we need to provide protective mechanisms for our employees when ethical issues do arise. So if someone reports something or raises an ethical issue, then that's something that we really want to make sure that that employee feels protected. We also want to recognize the trend for organizations to try to create positive organizational cultures. All right. Now, positive organizational culture is going to emphasize building on employees' strengths. Now, this sounds like a really easy thing to do, and it really should be, but it can be a little more challenging than we initially think. And the reason for that is that our employees tend to be very different. They might have different actual strengths. All right. So, if we want to capitalize on their strengths, we might not be able to put a blanket policy out there that goes ahead and does that, but we have to get to know our employees and understand them and figure out how we're going to utilize each one of their individual and unique strengths. Okay. A positive organizational culture is also going to reward more than it punishes. All right. So on the previous slide, I talked a little bit about management by exception. And management by exception is something that's been very common in management over the years. Okay. Where people focus more on identifying what's wrong and fixing that. And that really complements punishment very well. All right. So when we try to think about rewarding more than we punish, we might actually be changing the culture of what we expect for management. Okay. Now, many people get concerned when they think about rewarding over punishing because they say, well, if I don't recognize what's wrong, if I don't address what's wrong, I'm not doing my job. Well, here's the thing, if you recognize what people are doing right, they're going to strive to do that more. And ultimately, what's going to happen is their focus is going to be on doing what it is that you want them to do rather than avoiding what you don't want them to do. So we can focus on rewarding the right things. And if we reward the right behaviors, the wrong behaviors will start to go away with time. And finally, what we want to do in a positive organizational culture here is we want to emphasize individual growth. Okay, we want to make sure that people understand their development opportunities, that they have goals that they're working towards. We have to remember that today people are in the workforce for 40, 45, 50 years. And if you have someone in position, particularly early on in their career, and they don't see a pathway to get to something that is aligned with their goals, and they don't want to be in the position that they're in today, 40 years from now, then we're not going to have a very positive culture. All right. Our employees need to see a pathway to fulfilling their personal needs. And in today's context, it would be really difficult to talk about organizational culture without addressing workplace spirituality. Now, workplace spirituality is not about organized religious practices. All right. So this does not have anything to do with organized religion. Instead, workplace spirituality really deals with people having kind of nourishment of their inner self. Okay. And they have meaningful work and they connect with others. Now, embracing workplace spirituality is something that can be kind of challenging for managers, right? But there are a few things that leaders can do to help embrace workplace spirituality. All right. And one thing is that they can demonstrate values and attitudes that can help to foster intrinsic motivation amongst their employees. Because if our people are intrinsically motivated, they should find more connection between their work and their own needs and find fulfillment through their work. All right. We also can encourage our employees to consider how their work provides sense of purpose, connect them to their community, how their work impacts other people. And this is very much related to the task significance component of the job characteristics model. Now, there are some critics of workplace spirituality, however, and there are basically three different arguments that we hear from critics. All right. And the first one is, what is workplace spirituality? How do we define it? And if you go back to when we introduced workplace spirituality here in this video, one of the things that you could probably see is that there appears to be some ambiguity in what that definition is. And critics really focus on that. All right. The second component is, do organizations really have the right to impose spiritual values on their employees? So, depending on how specific we get in what we try to do to embrace workplace spirituality, we may actually be playing into the argument of critics. All right. And then finally, there's the economic component where people ask, is spirituality and profit really compatible? All right. So, if we're doing things to embrace workplace spirituality, are we putting our profits at risk? These are the kind of questions that you're going to have to grapple with if you're going to embrace workplace spirituality and try to make it a part of your organizational culture. It's also important to address the fact that organizational cultures often reflect national cultures. Okay. And managers who have only managed in one specific country may not necessarily recognize how their organizational culture is impacting employees from other parts of the world. So it's very important that managers are sensitive to how their organizational cultures are impacting members of a diverse workforce. Now, as we get ready to wrap up this lesson here, earlier on we started by talking about factors such as adaptability, detail orientation, results versus outcome orientation, people orientation, team orientation, and integrity. Now, how these factors are perceived contributes to how people view your organizational culture. And the consistency of perceptions is what determines the culture's strength. Okay. Now, when we consider your organizational culture, taken into account with the strength of the culture. These factors here influence the organization's performance and employee satisfaction with performance. All right, so that's a little bit on organizational culture here today. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.